You want to do the introducing the panel?
Can you see my presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Let me put it on.
Let's see. Oh, it looks like Daniele is here as a participant. So I'm gonna. Oh, and he's already allowed to talk. So. Okay.
Hi, everybody. I don't understand why I'm not here as a panelist. I will.
I'll fix it. I'll fix it.
Okay, thank you.
So can you all see the presentation now that I changed it to full screen?
No, it's
No?
it's black. It's all
It's
black.
black?
Yeah.
Okay, let me go
I-
back.
Yeah, it looks like a PDF.
Okay, you're a panelist now.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. So if you exit full screen, it should show.
Yeah.
Laura.
I'm
It's been an
doing
issue
that.
for the whole conference. There you go.
So let me at least, okay.
Yeah. So maybe. So what time is it? It's 10:02. I think it's a good time to get started, and people will come in, I think. So welcome everybody. My name is Daniele Tavani, and I'll be chairing the session on intersectional political economy and COVID-19. We had a cancellation at the last minute, so the last paper that was on the schedule is not going to be presented. That means that the presenters have more time for theirs. So we're going to start with Laura Carvalho. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniele, for chairing and organizing these sessions. Well, so I'll get started. I'm setting the time for 20 minutes here, but
I will give you a 5-minute timer. Let's do 25 minutes per paper.
25.
And yeah, I'll give you a 10-minute to 5-minute warnings.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, so this paper is co-authored with two of my former students at the University of São Paulo, Matias, who is still at the University of São Paulo, and Rodrigo, who is now a PhD student at Queen Mary University. And basically, the motivation of the study we carried out is to understand how fiscal policy may have had a different role in this crisis, in the COVID-19 crisis, as opposed to previous economic recessions. So usually the way the literature has dealt with the role of fiscal policy, and in particular the counter-cyclical role of fiscal policy, is to understand the size of fiscal multipliers and how it helped or it helps prevent larger shocks in demand, right? And this crisis in particular starts with a difference that we have all talked about a lot, which is it's not a purely demand side type of recession. We had both supply side and demand side shocks. And of course, that's not true for every sector, but many of the sectors in the economy had to be shut down, and that already changes the nature of the multiplier and the possibility of boosting aggregate demand as it establishes supply constraints. But at the same time, also from the demand side, the nature of the crisis is quite special because, of course, we have the standard effects of a downturn in terms of losses in income and in employment leading to lower consumption. But on top of that, you also had at the beginning, especially in the first year of the pandemic, you also had consumers that were insecure to go back to their consumption habits, and even not, it wasn't even desirable that they would do so. And that also may change how the multiplier kicks in, right? So you have at the same time supply constraints and demand constraints that may be different than in previous crises, given that it's not even in the interest of policymakers to just go back and try to boost aggregate demand and go back to what it was before, right? And in that sense, the fiscal efforts that has been very substantial around the world that countries have, that governments have carried, have implemented, they were not necessarily designed for their macroeconomic counter-cyclical role. They were designed for their health, their social, their macroeconomic implications. And by that, I mean, I don't mean that governments didn't have in mind that these efforts would have a consequence in terms of alleviating the downturn, but they were the objective or the main goal of these efforts was, depending on the composition of those responses, was more either to give the sufficient resources for the health sector, the healthcare sector, or to try to maintain a minimum or a basic income level for households who could then maintain, let's say, basic consumption and also be able to stay at home, as saving businesses in particular in certain sectors that were more affected. And so the change of the nature of these fiscal efforts were also not the same as in other stimulus packages in previous crises. So to start with, I mean, there's a macroeconomic conditions that are different, but also the type of fiscal efforts were also different in this crisis relative, for instance, to the global financial crisis. You do have some literature starting to show that is even only analyzing, I mean, that is already trying to assess the effect of these fiscal efforts on the health crisis itself. So for instance, you have this paper by Wright, who estimates a positive impact of the CARES Act stimulus checks on the degree of compliance to stay-at-home orders. So families that received the check tended to be more or were more prone to stay at home and actually obey, let's say, the health restrictions and containment measures. There's also some literature on the fiscal policy response that has examined these responses around the world, and there are very heterogeneous responses. This is something important to pinpoint before I start the exercise and the econometric exercise. So of course, countries with poor credit history were less able to deploy fiscal policy tools. So just to give you the number, IMF data show that advanced economies spent 27.7% of their GDP in additional measures or fiscal measures that were either in the spending side or the foregone revenue side, whereas emerging markets had a 6.7% average response. There's also a difference in composition, not only in the size of the response. So for instance, if you look at transfers to households, so social transfers, cash transfers, and so on, this represented 20% of total resources that were spent to fight the pandemic in advanced economies, and only 7.8% of the total response in emerging markets. When you look at health and employment programs, it's more similar. In terms of the share of the total, you had a more similar response between advanced and emerging economies. But in any case, I mean, there is quite some heterogeneity there in terms of the fiscal policy response. The existing literature that has looked into what we want to look at, namely, okay, even if we had very different goals and objectives in the fiscal response, and also even if we had also supply constraints and different demands, issues than in other crises. I mean, did it still matter for, in terms of the macroeconomic counter-cyclical role? I mean, how did these efforts compared to other crises help alleviate the downturn? I mean, did they have a counter-cyclical role in any case, right? And that's our question. I mean, this question has been answered in some microeconometric studies already. So you have evidence by for the EU that households' disposable income would have fallen by much more than it did, by almost 6% without any discretionary policy measures. You have a paper by Casado and co-authors that suggest, in the particular case of Illinois, with a data set that is for an actual reduction in the unemployment insurance benefits that happened in Illinois. They present evidence that the unemployment insurance in the US has attenuated the fall in consumer spending. So a 5% decrease in consumer spending was resulted from a reduction in $300 in the unemployment insurance benefits in Illinois. So you have some evidence already that seems to suggest that while, I mean, the nature of the crisis was different, you still had an important counter-cyclical role for fiscal policy. What we do in this study is to actually look at that with using macro data. So to try to assess what have been the macroeconomic effects of the fiscal response in this particular crisis, but by using time series econometrics data. And the big challenge, of course, is that, I mean, if you look at the literature on fiscal multipliers that use time series econometrics, usually what you have is a long time series, right? So you have fiscal multipliers being estimated and you have a long time series, and that makes it really hard to actually say what the role of the fiscal policy was in one particular crisis episode, right? So you even may have some studies showing how in downturns versus expansions, the multiplier is different and so on. But I mean, you don't have a precise assessment of what one particular fiscal response was, I mean, what the effect of one particular fiscal response was and one particular crisis, right? And what maybe the innovative approach we take here is that we are able to do that for this particular crisis because we use high frequency data. We have weekly data between 2020 and 2021. Since the beginning of since the start of the pandemic, right, up until I think August 2021 or September, which is when we ran the estimations. So we have 86 weeks. We have 45 countries, so we have a panel. What we do, so we need weekly data, is that we use 3 different data sets. So first we use the Oxford COVID-19 response tracker. This is basically for the control variables we use. And from there, we take the containment health index that they have, which is, they give you like an index that goes from 0 to 1, depending on how restrictive the health measures, I mean, the lockdowns and closing schools and a lot of other indicators that they take that are summarized in this index, including vaccines and the vaccine rollouts. We have the number of confirmed deaths. We also ran with confirmed cases of COVID-19, but then we also take our fiscal measure from that data set, and there they have weekly data, and I'll show you how this data looks like in a bit. But they have weekly data on non-health expenditures relative to and we put that relative to 2019 GDP. That includes income guarantee programs, employment programs, debt relief programs. It does not include, as it says here, health expenditures. So this is our fiscal variable. We have weekly data for that. We also use a variable that ends up being important in our results, which reflects the degree of social distancing that has been applied in the different countries. And we also have weekly data for that. So that comes from Google Mobility. So I'm not sure how familiar you are, but basically they give you the change in the number of people in certain transit stations at each point in time. So these stations include subway stations, taxi, rental car agencies, bus stop stations. And so they compile the number of people in these stations, and that reflects how much people were circulating at each point in time. So of course, that's a control variable for to take into account how many sectors were closed and how much people were outside of work during this time. Then you have the OECD, our economic activity variable, which is maybe what is more new here. I mean, we were able to have a weekly activity indicator that also helps us with exogenous problems, and I'll try to convince you why. So here we have an OECD weekly tracker of GDP growth. What is that? I mean, basically the OECD take data on searches, Google searches by economic agents of a lot of keywords, and they produce a nowcast for economic activity based on the number of searches for those keywords. Which keywords? I mean, there's a bunch of them. They have been building this nowcast for a long time, so they have estimated the elasticity of how the searches for these keywords actually relate to observed GDP data. And so they produced an estimate of economic activity that you see, but it actually tracks quite well the GDP data that is and other economic activity indicators that are available afterwards. So here we have, I'll tell you later, but there are two versions of this indicator. They produced one specifically in the pandemic because they had a problem with how well the indicator tracked GDP during the pandemic, and they fixed the year in 2019 in order to produce to keep estimating GDP. Just to give you a figure, so here is our fiscal variable, how it looks like. It's a cumulative variable, so you have how much is spent in non-health expenditures for the USA. So as you see, I mean, it's a little bit discrete in how it changes because, I mean, there are points in time and weeks where a bunch of these expenditures is made and other weeks in which no additional expenditures are made. But it's a weekly variable. And here's our measure of economic activity, the OECD tracker. So you have for the USA and Great Britain here, the UK. So you basically, you see that you do have the actual GDP growth in black and the weekly tracker in green. I mean, it does track the main movements. To give you a number, I mean, more than 70% of the cases, they also give you like a floor and a ceiling for the tracker. And in more than 70% of the observations, the actual GDP, I mean, historically has been within the interval of the nowcast, right? So it does a pretty good job. And so based on this data, what we did was to run a two-way fixed effects regression for this panel of 45 countries. The dependent variable is the GDP tracker. And then you have the fiscal variable and other control variables, right? The control variables are exactly the containment health index, the confirmed COVID-19 cases or death numbers, and the mobility index that I have just explained, right? The main assumption here that is quite important, and we also ran some tests and some event studies to see if it actually holds, is that, of course, the only channel through which fiscal policy affects GDP, the tracker, namely how, and just a reminder, so the tracker is based on the searches by actual economic agents in the internet. So they go online and they search for, let's say, unemployment or different words that are linked to GDP, right? So the assumption here is that the only channel through which fiscal policy affects the weekly tracker is by actually changing economic activity itself. So it's not that agents are reacting to the fiscal policy or to the expenditures directly, right? So we needed to go through economic activity. And the other assumption is that the tracker is not a tool that is actually used by governments to formulate. So it's not that our fiscal variable is responding to how the economic agents searches, right? So the government is not looking at the tracker in order to spend more in that week, in that same week, right? So this is an important assumption. I'll go back to that in a little bit. To give you the results. So basically, in all our estimations, we find a very statistically significant and substantial effect of our fiscal variable on our GDP variable, which suggests that even in spite of all the differences between this crisis and other crises, you actually had, say, that a 1% increase in our fiscal variable leads to a close to 1% increase also in our GDP growth by the tracker, right? So this is comparable to what the literature had found for other crises, which for us was quite surprising because we would expect that the multiplier was smaller given all these features that I have tried to give you as motivation at the beginning. We also found a very interesting result, which is when we control for the containment health index, actually, and the confirmed death, well, the confirmed death did not show significant result in this very weekly, right, this very instantaneous effect of fiscal policy basically on this very high frequency estimations here. But the containment health index actually changes. I mean, it's when we run the estimations with that measure only, it shows a negative effect on GDP, non-significant. But when we add the transit variable, which is based on how much people are actually circulating, then you actually change the sign and the magnitude and the significance actually of the containment health index. And the way we interpret this is that, so once you take into account or once you extract the negative effect on GDP of the shutdown and the direct negative effect, meaning that people are not going to work, people are at home, once you extract that from the effect of the health index, the containment health measures actually show a positive effect on GDP instead of a negative effect. And of course, that health measure, the containment health index includes vaccines, includes other aspects of the restrictions, right? So there, the transit variable actually absorbs part of the negative effect that was showing in the second round of estimations. The transit variable here is the higher the transit, of course, the more people are circulating. So this means that the more, let's say, the more social distancing, the lower is GDP, and that's expected as well. These are our main results. To summarize, a 1% change in our fiscal measure raised economic activity by almost 1%. And I have already explained that as we disentangle health measures from restrictions on mobility, the containment health index starts showing a positive, significant effect on economic activity. We have ran alternative specifications The first difference there is that we changed the fiscal variable. We changed the OECD tracker because, as I mentioned at the beginning, they have two versions of it. One is year-on-year changes on GDP. The other one has fixed the GDP in 2019 for the pandemic period. Both of them, all the estimations still lead to a significant positive effect of the fiscal variable on GDP. We also ran event studies. So the question here is that, okay, what if economies recovering more quickly were also more capable of increasing expenditures? So there could be an endogeneity issue that basically would make our, that would bias our results. So maybe, I mean, someone could ask, okay, but maybe it's actually the fiscal variable that is responding, they're both responding to the same thing here, which is an economy that is going better. Governments are more able to deploy fiscal policy tools. And so these things could be capturing a previous economic upturn and instead of the effect of fiscal policy on economic activity, which would lead potentially to a rejection of the parallel trend hypothesis in the absence of treatment, which is crucial to this type of estimations. So in order to check for that, we estimate other specifications in which lagged values and lead variables of the fiscal variable are included. And we see that, in fact, the lagged expenditure appears as significant and the leads are statistically not different from zero, which confirms the temporal precedence of fiscal policy to economic activity. So it's not the other way around. So we have all that in detail in the paper. To conclude, so I mean, the good news, let's say, is that in spite of the special nature of this crisis, while multiplier effects may have not operated in the same way, and even governments were not even interested in boosting aggregate demand at the beginning of the pandemic, given the need to attack the causes of the pandemic and the sanitary aspect of it. Still, fiscal responses have been very significant in attenuating the fall in economic activity around the world, and this is what our results suggest here. But of course, I mean, the other side of the story is that, as we mentioned at the beginning, I mean, these fiscal responses were very heterogeneous around the world, and you had much less capacity to deploy these tools in the global south than in advanced economies, which means that in addition to a lot of other structural aspects that made this crisis hit developing countries much harder, such as the degree of informality in the labor market, the share of services in GDP, which are disproportionately affected in this crisis, and social vulnerability in several dimensions. I mean, on top of all these aspects that made the crisis hit developing countries harder, of course, the different magnitudes of the fiscal responses and the fact that you did not have the same fiscal space in developing countries to transfer income to households and do other of these policies is, of course, an additional driver of world inequalities as we come out of the pandemic. So this is what I had, and I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for a very stimulating paper. So I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. I know that it takes a little time to type, so if you feel like you're a slow typer, please raise your hand, and I'll try to look in the attendance part of my screen to see if people have questions. I mean, I have while we wait, I have a little question about your identifying assumption. Why would you assume that the governments don't look at the Google tracker? I mean, the OECD tracker, right? Presumably they have experts that, they are economists and they are thinking about, measures of economic activity in real time. So can you say a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, sure. So first, I mean, there is already the fact that we're talking about weekly data of actual expenditures that are made. So, I mean, to think that a government would look into the real-time data in that same week and be able to spend the money right at the same week, I mean, given the process of, I mean, of actually approving budgetary expenditures and so on, I mean, that already would hint that maybe it's not the case. But then we also ran these event study that was exactly aiming at looking into the possibility that leads and lags would have different effects, and there we see, I mean, our results suggest that there is a temporal precedence from the fiscal variable to the GDP variable, and that we don't have the fiscal variable, like the lagged fiscal variable, the lead fiscal variable, actually the response in the other way around, let's say. And so, I mean, I think we don't need, and maybe that's the way I phrase it, we don't need to assume that the government never uses the OECD tracker. We only need to assume that the government doesn't respond immediately to the GDP tracker by spending more, and that the precedence is in that way around. And I mean, someone has asked me in a previous presentation, and I think it was a pretty good question, which is, okay, the more researchers are using the OECD tracker, in a way, the less this is suitable as let's say, as a good identification strategy. And
Absolutely.
It's true. I mean, maybe we have a first mover advantage here of trying to use this, and at some point it won't be a good exercise anymore. But at this point, I mean, I think that it seems to hold.
Yeah, the other thing, since you know, the chat is the Q&A is quiet, the other thing, can you say more a little bit more about the lead lag structure? Because I understand the lagged version, and it's been shown that it actually emphasizes, you know, that is an attenuate the endogeneity stuff, the endogeneity problem. But what about the leads, and how can you conclude from your lead lag results that fiscal policy is you know, it happens first, and then economic activity increases after.
Okay. Yeah, I wish I had the slides with the results here so that I could explain it better. But the main idea here is that, okay, so we include the contemporaneous fiscal policy that we already had in the other exercise. So in the main specifications, the results that I show, you had fiscal policy in the same week as the economic activity variable. And what we do in this event study is that, okay, we add on top of that contemporaneous variable 2-week lagged expenditures, and the expenditures in the weeks after. So the leads in the 2-week after the actual economic activity, right? So if we had a problem, which is, say, the government was responding, so we have a previous economic upturn, so GDP is growing, and this allows the government to spend more, then what you would see is that the leads, so the fiscal variable after, would actually have a significant response. They would show a significant effect because they would capture this. So the fact that GDP increases would increase fiscal expenditures. And that's exactly what we don't want to happen, because that would mean that maybe what we're capturing in our own exercise, in the contemporaneous exercise, is the other way around. And what we see is that, no, those leads actually show no statistical significance. And instead, the lagged expenditures appear as significant. And so that's exactly the kind of the direction that we need here to sort of stress. And the event study itself is a result. And we even considered actually changing the structure of the paper and having the event study as part of the main exercise in that sense, right? It's not only a check, because it actually gives you the lagged effects also of the fiscal variable on GDP.
Got it. Thank you. So if there's no further questions from the chat, I encourage people to think about the paper and possibly ask questions at the end of the toward the end of the session. But I would like to move on to the next presenter, Catherine Mose from University of Massachusetts Amherst. So over to you, Catherine.
Great, thanks, Daniele, and thanks for that presentation, Laura. That was wonderful. Let me just share my slides. Okay, do people see them? See the slides okay? Let me just, okay.
Yeah.
They're being seen. Okay, wonderful. So thank you, Daniele, for organizing this great session. So
just sorry
I,
to interrupt.
Yeah.
Very quickly, in full screen, sometimes the slides don't go forward. So just make sure that they do, because sometimes, okay, perfect.
Did it
Thank you so
advance?
much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you
checking.
so much.
Yeah, no, thanks for checking. I forgot about that glitch sometimes. Okay, so I'm Catherine Mose. I'm assistant professor at UMass Amherst, and I'm going to be presenting a paper that was published in Feminist Economics, special issue on COVID-19, and it is about coronavirus fiscal policy in the United States from a feminist political economy perspective. So just to give you some background about this paper, my interest at the beginning of the crisis, I think a lot of us as economists and as scholars were trying to understand the crisis and trying to figure out what we could say about it. And that often sort of pulled on our own research interests and our own research experience. And that was certainly the case for me. So I started thinking about the crisis and the US response to the crisis and trying to understand it from the perspective of social reproduction theory and understand it from trying to understand how the US state would respond to a crisis of social reproduction as it was unfolding. So here in this paper, I used the fiscal response to COVID-19 in March and April 2020 as a case study to answer this sort of bigger question that is really important to my research. And the way that I frame that is I'm trying to understand the implications of the coronavirus legislation in the distribution for the responsibility for social reproduction. So the way I look at this question is that social reproduction, society's social reproduction is shared among households, employers, and the federal government, and the state government, but in this case, I'm looking at the federal government, and how the crisis and the legislation shifted that responsibility or changed things. Of course, I'm also looking at this from an intersectional feminist lens, so I'm also interested in how the legislation and the underlying societal distribution for social reproduction affects women and racialized minorities in particular. And as I said before, this is building on my prior research on the US and on social reproduction in the US. And I've argued elsewhere that even prior to the pandemic, economic crisis, such as the financial crisis, the Great Recession, and stagnating conditions for workers overall in the US since the 1970s have increased the role of households and the government in social reproduction relative to the contribution of employers. So this is a trend that I have identified prior to the pandemic, and I went in sort of with this, this prior. Oh, are we now not advancing? Oh, here we go. Okay, so summary of findings. So as many of you know, probably all of you, the pandemic prompted the US Congress to spend an historic amount of money. And this is just the first 4 bills. This doesn't include what happened later. And I analyze this and say that about 69% of the overall spending from March and April 2020 was allocated to social reproduction purposes. And I'll tell you a bit more what I mean by that. I argue that Congress responded more to the collapse of aggregate demand than to the health crisis, and that this improved the livelihood of some groups while disadvantaging others. In particular, I believe it left low-wage workers, women, and racialized minorities in vulnerable positions. So what did I do in this paper? So because I was analyzing this legislation sort of as it was being passed, I couldn't sort of do I couldn't analyze the cost of the legislation ex post. It was much more as it was planned, and what I relied on for that was the cost estimates that are produced by the Congressional Budget Office for every piece of federal legislation. And I compared the costs of these bills to projections that the CBO had made for the US economy pre-pandemic, which had actually been published in early March 2020, right before the pandemic. And so I was able to compare the CBO estimates with and without the coronavirus legislation to understand the effect of the COVID-19 funding on social reproduction. Now, of course, this is just telling us what information Congress had on the anticipated effect of the legislation. Again, this is not ex post, but this is, I thought this could give us some interesting information. And what I did is I went through these cost estimates line by line, and I categorized things into social reproduction expenditures, which included education, health, and income support, and non-social reproduction expenditures, which was all other spending and tax cuts that were really more for firms and government agencies, and were not things that were going to trickle back to workers as immediately. I want to just be clear that this is actually a pretty narrow definition of social reproduction expenditures. In other work, I have a much broader vision of what social reproduction and social reproduction spending is, and it would include things like roads and bridges and recreation and all kinds of things. But in this case, I really sort of focused on the bare bones of social reproduction. So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so why did I take this approach? Well, as I said before, I was trying to figure out, what I, as a feminist political economist, could say about the crisis sort of as it was happening. And I wanted to build on some of my earlier work on social reproduction, the requirements of social reproduction and capital accumulation and how they affect state policy making. So that's really, oh, sorry. So a question, does non-social reproduction expenditures include loans such as PPP loans? Yes, yes, it does. So that's a great question I can come back to later. Okay. Yeah, okay. And so, and also I wanted to build on sort of prior empirical work on the role of the US state in social reproduction, which the paper in the RRPE that looks at redistributive policy from using the net social wage approach, which is originally created by Anwar Sheikh and Amit Tonak, and looks at the net social wage. I've also created my own approach to measuring the cost of social reproduction, which is inspired by the net social wage, but it includes unwaged household production in estimating the cost of social reproduction. But I couldn't use either of these approaches, even though I'm very familiar with them, because they rely on BEA data that would not be available, that was not available yet, and that's why I again use the CBO scores. Okay, so here are the four bills. Folks are probably pretty familiar with them. There was the big one was the CARES Act, but all of them had important implications for social reproduction, and some of them were allocated almost entirely to social reproduction, and some were less so. Okay, so using this information that I had, I wanted to understand the role of the federal fiscal spending and social reproduction with and without COVID-19. So here's where I do the comparison. And I argue that overall, Congress is responding more to this crisis of lost incomes, to the public health crisis. So as a result of the legislation, income support, so this came through things like the direct transfers to families and individuals, also to loans to businesses to continue to pay their workers, increased from 11% to 22% of federal expenditures, whereas health, including publicly funded health insurance, actually decreased as a share of federal expenditures and only increased in absolute terms quite modestly, from 695.8 billion to about 700 billion. So I found this somewhat striking that we were in a public health crisis that was also an economic crisis, but it appeared to me in March and April 2020 to really being treated as first and foremost a crisis of aggregate demand. Now, I talk in the paper about path dependency and inertia in policymaking certainly could have played a role, but I don't believe that it explains all of the policy choices that were made at this time, because there was an increase of funding for old programs like unemployment insurance, the special nutrition assistance program, and direct transfers that come really as a negative income tax, which is a favorite policy in the US, but also some creation of new policies like paid job protected leave. Of course, this was only for COVID-19 related absences, but this is this was a break in this kind of policy really being a non-starter at the federal level for quite some time, and turns out it continues to be. Okay, so then I looked at sort of what the role of US households in social reproduction, how that changed, and there's been a lot of literature on this, because that's of course part of the story of the distribution for social reproduction and the distribution of the burden and the contribution of social reproduction. So here I'm citing my paper that's published in Rose, where I find that between 1959 and 2012, unpaid household production contributed more to working class social reproduction than earned income or employer-based benefits and contributions. And so this is something, again, I knew going into this research. And we see as a result of the pandemic that the relative contribution of unpaid household work also increased due to school and work closures and stay-at-home orders is sort of well documented and talked about both in people's research and also in the mainstream press. There's also been a lot of discussion of how this reinforced and intensified traditional gender division of labor, that hours of housework increased for all, but the distribution typically stayed the same. This is a similar pattern that was also observed during the Great Recession. And mothers were especially hard hit and dropped out of the workforce. So then I looked at the role of employers in social reproduction, and I am again drawing on my prior work that is looking at there's already been a secular downward trend in employer contributions to working class social reproduction, and that's because wages have stagnated and employer-based benefits have also degraded and stagnated, and so this ratio of the contribution of employers to overall societal social reproduction has dropped. And this, I find in my prior research, is very heavily influenced by the business cycle. And we see, of course, in the COVID-19 crisis that this intensified, where employers withdrew from working class social reproduction in the amount of jobs that were lost, and also how many workers lost their health insurance, which is of course a feature of the US healthcare system, that it's largely employer-based, and people lost their health insurance during a global pandemic. So this has some pretty serious implications for gender and racial inequality that really build on what was already happening prior to the pandemic, where people of color were in more vulnerable positions with more precarious jobs, more economically insecure than their white counterparts. And we've seen that the pandemic intensified these inequalities. And here we see that the unemployment rates were much higher for women and racialized minorities and women of color in particular. And the recovery has also been slower for these groups. And so we see that this has been particularly hard-hitting for women in the service sector and who are segmented into sectors that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Okay, so really getting back to the role of the US welfare state in social reproduction, which is kind of the main interest that I'm bringing to this, is we all probably have a sense of the US welfare state as it compares to other OECD countries. It's quite embarrassing and pathetic in some ways. It's marked by stingy, contributory, non-universal benefits. And as I mentioned before, we don't have a universal healthcare system or paid maternity leave. But what I have found in my research is that there's actually a very contradictory role of the state in the neoliberal era, and that austerity has actually produced this very contradictory role. So actually US federal spending continues to rise despite the well-documented attack on the welfare state. And I can talk a little bit more about that in terms of sort of the specifics of it. And from a cost of social reproduction perspective, thinking about the distribution of social reproduction, even though we see these assaults on the benefits and the welfare state and the security that the welfare state could offer, we actually see the state playing a bigger role than employers in overall social reproduction, starting in the mid-90s, which is unusual when you go at it thinking about what we know about neoliberalism, what we know about welfare reform. And so of course there's some secular reasons for this. We have an aging population, we have rising healthcare costs, which are a big part of federal spending on the welfare state. But I also argue that it's due to actually the increased vulnerability of US workers. So a decrease in labor protections and collective bargaining, the erosion of employer-based benefits, wage stagnation, prolonged unemployment, low-wage jobs, et cetera, have actually prompted some of the few protections that do exist for low-wage workers or for families with children to actually increase their spending in some places, or be substituted for other kinds of programs, because there's been this assault on workers overall. Okay, so to conclude, what I'm arguing here is that due to these COVID relief bills, the US state infused an enormous amount of income support, but it didn't increase its long-term socially reproductive commitments. So we did see the US state spend an historic amount of money, but it didn't really address the intensified burden placed on households or the declining role of employers in working class social reproduction. And this policy, in some ways, and the crisis in general, further disadvantaged women relative to men and racialized minorities, especially immigrants relative to whites and US citizens. So it should be stated that households containing immigrants weren't able to access much of the relief, including the direct stimulus checks. And that really, puts an enormous burden on these households and an enormous disadvantage when other households are receiving this influx of income support. And here I'm really trying to problematize the increased role of the US state in social reproduction. So on the one hand, I am, in full support of a strong welfare state, and I believe there are enormous benefits to social insurance in terms of equity, efficiency, and reliability. But in the US case, and in this particular case study, there's also some risks for marginalized and racialized communities when it's the federal government that's stepping in to act as what I call the social reproducer of last resort, because they don't necessarily have equity in mind, and they don't necessarily plan to even the playing field, and can actually worsen some of these hierarchical structures. So I argue that these policies and all policies really need to be understood in the political economic context. And yeah, as I said before, that the increased role of the state can advantage some groups while disadvantaging others. And I really wanted to tease out this idea that cash transfers won't automatically achieve feminist goals in the US context. I'm certainly not against cash transfers, but I was responding to some of the feminist literature that I think looks at something like a UBI with a little bit too much of rose-colored glasses, whereas it's really important to think about, what it really does in a context like the US, which is so racially divided with so much gender inequity sort of baked into the system. Because we need to keep in mind that these are also subsidies for low-wage employers in the private sector. And without addressing some of these underlying issues in terms of collective bargaining, in terms of workers' rights, we can actually see a worsening of some of these conditions. So what's next? Well, there's been even more money put into COVID relief. So that's something that could certainly be analyzed. I wrote these slides when there was still sort of hope that the infrastructure and social policy bills might pass, although you can tell I was not so optimistic. And I think it would be worthwhile to go back and actually do this analysis using BEA data to actually see how it played out. And there's been a lot more discussion of was the money actually allocated properly, and so on and so forth. And then really analyze this era in a longer historical episode, because I'm looking at the first 2 months of the crisis, but a lot more has happened since then. So in that sense, there's a lot more to do. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This was great. Again, please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. While we wait, I have a couple of reactions on your point about the relevance of fiscal policy in US history. So there's two things. The share of non-Social Security fiscal policy in GDP, fiscal expenditures in GDP in the United States has been actually steadily declining. I can actually, I have a little slide on this. If you can see my screen. I don't know, wait up. I'm trying to share my screen. Yeah, so that's, so as you can see, I don't know, can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the federal government spending, government consumption plus gross investment. This excludes Social Security spending. So I think that as a fraction of GDP, we're seeing, some of the starving the beast that has been happening. Yeah, so that's the first reaction. I'm gonna stop sharing. The second reaction is to your point about the relevance of health expenditures as a response to the crisis, right? I think over there's probably a denominator problem. The fact that the share of like this federal spending has increased so much that it's very likely that the share of that spending that went to health has fallen just because the denominator has increased. So I encourage you to look into this. I don't know. I didn't look at the data, but it's possible that the story is a little more nuanced than what you presented at the beginning. This is nothing to detract from your argument, because, which I find very convincing, but in terms of sort of quick reactions.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I do talk about the absolute spending on health increasing modestly, but it was very modest. And that may, if we were looking at the situation now with vaccines, this was pre-vaccines, this was free COVID tests and stuff like that, this could be quite different. But this was just my looking at the early laws and seeing that there was really no, other than they made it Medicare could do telehealth. That was one of the few things, that was really, and there was a little bit of money put into like public health research and promotion, but it was really teeny tiny. So that was really the bigger point I was trying to make. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The fact that the spending went up so much is why it decreased as a share. So that is discussed. And it is true that Social Security is pushing the increase in spending overall. But even if you look at some of these other social programs, I mean, some of them have been wiped out completely, and at the state level, they've been, wiped out completely. But what I've seen, and I don't get into the details in this paper, but in other work, we see some programs are eliminated, but then like a huge expansion of the earned income tax credit. So, which happened in the welfare reform era. So what I'm trying to argue is that there's been a sort of substitution of certain kinds of income support for in-work benefits, which is what is supporting this low wage work. So it's true. I mean, and I think you're right to the delivery needs to be more nuanced in that sense, because but yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I have a follow-up, but there's 2 questions from the audience, so I encourage you to read them because the audience can't see the questions, and then and if we have time, I'll go again.
So Patty Quit said, do you have data on state expenditures for unemployment insurance? No, so I did not, because I was only looking at these 4 bills. This is a federal analysis. So that also, and I talk a tiny bit about that in this paper, that also leaves out a huge part of the story where some states were able to respond and did a lot of things that other states did not. So there's also inequity in terms of location, and that's a whole another piece of the story that I didn't get to. So no, that would be a really interesting, and now that it's been almost 2 years of this nightmare, there's more data to work with. So I was really, kind of like what was available to me then, and it was just to look at this federal data. So okay, so that's Patty's question. David asks, is there a reason for Congress focus on income support rather than public health in the COVID crisis due to Republicans and some Democrats being opposed to public health spending for ideological reasons? Yes, I mean, I think that was certainly my hunch back in March and April 2020 was they would sooner put all this money into the economy in a one-time transfer than reform our completely messed up health system. And that's still the case, right? I mean, it was still, there's still, the response to the crisis was not Medicare for all. But I do think that now that we've seen free vaccines and free testing and all of these things, I think there is something that needs to be complicated. But I think the bigger answer about, why there's still commitment to our health system, which was so poorly equipped to deal with this crisis. I mean, the fact that more people lost health insurance during this crisis than at any other time in US history is just a stunning fact, I think. So I hope that answered David's question.
Okay, so while we wait for some more questions, since you were so efficient in your presentation, I'm gonna follow up on my question on compositional government spending. So in a way, the political economy of the difference between consumption, government consumption and investment and Social Security is interesting from a social reproduction standpoint, right? So because I would say that Social Security is social reproduction spending, right?
Oh yeah.
And but the political economy of retirees versus current workers and the gendered aspects of that are, like, I think, extremely interesting, right? So I wonder if you have any perspective on that, and maybe just think about for future work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and just I'll answer it, and then if I am answering it, if I didn't capture the whole question, please repeat it. But yeah, so Social Security is included in this as a social reproduction expenditure in my analysis, in any analysis I've done, but it didn't increase as a result of the crisis. So I did break out income support as different than Social Security. And yeah, the fact that we have this very robust Social Security program for retirees, but not for other people, I think for younger people, I think is very much a feature of the US social reproduction approach, I guess you could say. And there are huge gender implications in terms of people's earnings, women earning less and taking time out of the labor market for care responsibilities, and that affects their long-term social reproduction as they age because of Social Security. So I think this is a huge part of the story. I don't know if there was another piece of the question that I.
No, that's all.
But yeah.
It's
Yeah.
pretty much up in the air, but thank you,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
And the changes in the gender composition of the labor force, like from the boomers era where like it was mostly like males working, and as women enter the labor force, it's going to change that political economy as well going forward. But of course, like it's anyone's guess, like about like the actual forces that are going to shape that. Yeah, absolutely. But
Well,
thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and just one more thing. I mean, there's just so many detailed things that someone could look at. I mean, in terms of when people claim benefits and the level of the benefits they get, and low-income workers getting fewer benefits. I mean, there's just, yeah, so there's a lot to say there. Yes, Laura, please, if you have a question.
Yeah, just a quick comment, because I was working on some of the data for other countries. Maybe your point on the share of non-health versus health could be made stronger if you actually look at this composition for other countries. I just gave it a check now because I had the spreadsheet with me. And in fact, I mean, if you look at the G20 economies, the US seems to be the most disproportionate in terms of how much more non-health expenditures were made relative to health. So that's very quickly available at the IMF fiscal. I think they have a fiscal COVID-19 fiscal database, and maybe it just stresses your point. That's it. But yeah, very nice.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And I wrote that down, but I may follow up with you if I.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because I think that was sort of my hunch, was that but because I was looking at it in a very narrow, I was saying I'm going to do a case study on the US for 2 months. I mean, it's a very narrow universe. But yeah. Oh,
let me just show you the figures so you see it now. I mean, the blue is so the blue is health.
Yep.
And the whatever orange is non-health. So if you look at the US, it's to the right here, the last bars. You see that the orange, which is non-health, is much larger, the non-health expenditures. I mean, it would be nice to look at the ratio or something.
The ratio would be really helpful.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, it can do that. But in any case, like if you look at other countries, it doesn't look as big.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
But all of them have, just another thing that is worth mentioning is that all of them did way more non-health expenditures than health expenditures. Even France, I mean, there's no example of economy that has actually spent more with health than with all the other stuff. And that may also give it a little bit more nuance to the very US type of explanation.
Right, and it was it is a very serious economic crisis. So in some ways, it's not completely fair to say, oh, we should have only had, and what was the solution necessarily. But so I think that is very helpful.
I hate to interrupt the discussion, but we have another presenter, so I just want to move on. Thank you, Catherine. And so our next speaker is Jen Cohen from Miami University. I'm very excited, that she's here. So please go ahead.
All right. So hi, everybody. I'm not sure how exactly this shows up. You may need to change the viewing people into just seeing the speaker if you don't just see me anyway. But I'm going to do this Prezi version of this. So we'll see We'll see if that works. It just froze for a second before. So if it does freeze, I'll be back in 20 seconds. So first I want to say thank you to Daniele and to Lara and to Catherine. These are really great presentations. I'm really grateful to be here for this panel. By way of introduction for myself, I'm a professor at Miami University. I'm an economist, but I'm in the global and intercultural studies there, and I'm on the medical faculty of a major university in South Africa, the University of the Witwatersrand. So I've been doing research there on nurses. So I decided to move away from a little bit of what was in the abstract that I submitted because that paper has already been published. It's in Global Public Health. And I gave that talk a while ago, a short version of that talk on the ERPI forum. And so that's on YouTube. So if anyone is interested in that, I'm happy to answer questions from it and refer people around for it. What I am going to talk about is partly from this nurse research that I've done, which I guess speaks a little bit to one of the lines that Catherine was sort of left off with, which was how the US was equipped for a global pandemic. This is really how is the world equipped for the global pandemic, specifically from the World Health Organization. So I was asked to write a sort of review paper of the Global Strategy for Human Resources for Health 2030. Right, so this was a plan that was adopted by the 69th World Health Assembly, which is the decision-making body of the WHO, in 2016. And so they're doing a 5-year check-in, and they have this policy document that they wanted a gender analysis of, basically. And so this is going into the Human Resources for Health journal. It's a World Health Organization journal. At least that's the plan. It's a World Health Organization journal, so it's slightly less radical than what is there in that abstract, but is very much related to it. So all of these things that I was concerned about and talking about with COVID capitalism from the beginning still apply in this. There are still concerns about endogeneity and destabilization of healthcare systems and of public health. So part of this paper is about unconventional determinants of healthcare system capacity. And so what I've done is a qualitative study of the gender division of household labor and nursing as part of a much larger study that I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. In terms of what we think about as determinants of healthcare system capacity, we've all been hearing about this now for the last 2.5 years or so, 2 years or so of COVID, where everyone was concerned about the number of hospital beds and everyone was concerned about the number of ventilators that were available. And then there was a brief concern about oxygen being available, but that especially in less developed countries. One of the things that you didn't hear, you heard a little bit about healthcare workers themselves, but you didn't hear anything about the gender division of labor in healthcare worker households. And yet this is a pretty key determinant of healthcare system capacity that impacts the healthcare system through things like absenteeism, right? Absent healthcare workers, but also influences us just through the healthcare practitioners' capacity to handle the workload that's there. So while we have these inputs to health that are things like hospital beds and oxygen and ventilators, another input to health obviously is the labor that goes into that. So that work impacts the quantity and quality of care that's supplied, and not just during pandemics, which shouldn't be a surprise, right? I mean, if we have a bunch of healthcare workers that get sick or out, then their work is redistributed to a smaller number of healthcare workers, which increases possibilities of burnout and then later absenteeism. Practitioner well-being, sort of broadly, has very, very wide impacts and across all levels. So they impact individuals, it impacts families, it impacts communities, it impacts the system itself, and then it impacts population health overall. So the well-being of healthcare practitioners is really what keeps the economy going, but what keeps social reproduction going, more importantly, is what keeps people alive. For underdeveloped countries, it's especially common that nurses are the most senior healthcare resource that's available. So nurses' health in particular is especially important. 85% of nurses and midwives are women, right? And what this means, and it's higher in some countries, this is globally, and there is also a global shortage. Right? But what this means is that anything that is a systemic challenge to healthcare workers, to women, is a systemic challenge also to the healthcare system itself, because those things can be destabilizing through the individual workers. Although, as I'll talk about, it's not just through individual workers because of the way that the work is shared. So 85% of nurses and midwives globally are women. Anything that's a challenge for women then is going to be a challenge also to healthcare systems. So this is this report / plan, the Global Strategy on Human Resources for Health, Workforce 2030. So it's specifically about the workforce. And so, of course, the first thing I went through doing was a Control F search on where gender and women were mentioned in this policy document, which is about 80 pages long. I think that there are 4 mentions of gender and 1 mention of women, which is odd, seeing as the workforce now and that there's a massive shortage of that. Seeing as that is 85% women, you would think that there would be, at least some concern about women, possibly a gender analysis, which is one of the reasons that doing this check-in at 5 years is really important. Really importantly, the report lays out vision, overall goals, principles, objectives, and milestones, and none of those mention women. Right? They all talk about the workforce, but none of them mention women. And they do at points go into talking about gender awareness, where gender awareness is important, where they say like we need gender sensitive employment conditions, gender sensitive attraction and retention policies, and then enabling gender sensitive working environment. That's great. But when you just talk about things from like a gender sensitivity perspective, you're actually missing the way that gender roles impact people, right? Like you're saying we need a gender sensitive approach is not actually meaningful if we don't know what the gender roles are that impact women and what the gender sensitivity is actually really to, right? And so a lot of the language that's in these kinds of reports is pretty minimal in that regard. Although there are reports also from the World Health Organization that were much more focused on this, and I might be able to come back and talk about that later. So gender awareness is inadequate. Gender sensitivity is inadequate in these plans. So part of my argument is that gender roles that assign responsibility for unpaid work in the household combine with occupational demands and function as determinants of healthcare system capacity, right? This is not a surprise based on any of my other work. This is, a very clear, like, women who are nurses experience stress, not because stress comes from the household, but because of the way that that the paid work shapes their household needs, including things like shift work, meaning that they need 14 hours of childcare because they have an hour commute on each end of a 12-hour shift, right? So the work itself actually creates the social reproduction problems in the household. So one of the things that the report is very concerned about is absenteeism. And so this gender analysis that I'm doing really is critical of most of the approaches to absenteeism in the literature, where it is treated, as most workers are, as in these reports, as a gender neutral individual phenomenon that's a labor supply decision, right? The reason that this is important is that people are implicitly, at least, coming from a kind of separate spheres gender ideology, right? That there's paid work and there's paid workers and they do one thing, and then there's the household and these things are personal concerns and they're individual issues with individual workers, right? So, this is the kind of thing that an individual worker might get reprimanded for, but the argument here is that it's not actually an individual worker problem, that this is systemic to the occupation itself. So absence, missing work, absenteeism, chronic absence. The neoclassical version of this posits a rational individual making a decision between leisure and labor. And their argument is that absence presents a moral hazard problem, that it's a way for an individual to choose both leisure and pay, right? In the real world, analyses of this are more complex. There's multifactorial causality from organizations, management, workers. So there's some recognition that this isn't just a labor supply decision, but both of these really still frame the issue as something that creates personal problems, whether it's coming from the institution or management or whatever, that those are things that are individual worker problems. So when it's presented that way as something that's a personal problem or individual problem, then it appears as a labor supply problem. And so this has been framed in literature as shirking, where then workers appear to be uncaring about their work, especially if they're doing human-oriented work like education or health. And if these absences are seen as voluntary, then they're viewed as illegitimate, right? Regardless of what the cause of them actually is. I have this note down here that maybe I can come back to, but basically talks about the amount of work that women do when you include unpaid work, and ends up being a couple of extra weeks, I think, per year. So a feminist radical political economy or a feminist less radical political economy take on this that I'm writing into this article takes a more critical look at decision-making under constraints and structures. So we're looking at actually existing human beings making actual decisions that take place under a range of constraints, including things like gender oppression and racial oppression and those hierarchies. So not just a budget constraint. So what we see is that occupational demands create these stressors, right? That those things aren't coming from one place or the other, it's a combination. So this isn't a question of work-life balance, as if those two things are separate and they could be better balanced, right? It's also not a thing of life-work integration, as some people have been talking about more recently. What's happening is that people are coping with the occupational demands at great cost to themselves. Women are coping with these occupational demands at great cost to themselves, including whether they raise their children in their own household, for example, because the occupation dictates where they live and a whole range of other things. So the household, especially from nurses' perspective, may not be the problem, but gender inequality certainly is the problem. And basically what we're seeing is that we have this ideal worker model that posits the ideal worker as someone who's unconstrained by issues in the household. And this holds even in an occupation that's 85% women, which means that if we really are hoping in the future for more flexible work policies and more emphasis on the household and social reproduction, this would be one of the occupations where we might expect that being so dominated by women, it might be more flexible and might have some ways of managing this better, and it does not. In terms of what that report says, some of the information that it wants about absenteeism is in the data collection section, and that data that's going to be collected is on absence, absenteeism, and their root causes. There's no mention of gender. Again, there's no mention of women, but it's pretty difficult to say that you could interpret the data that they're going to collect without having a perspective on the gender division of labor in the household. It's really needed to interpret what absenteeism is and what the root causes are, right? So the absenteeism stuff, absences that are, so this is really like a pretty fundamental point, right? Absences are predictable for women with kids. Absences are predictable for people with care duties. Right? Absence from paid work is going to happen because people have other demands outside of paid work. But the fact that they're predictable means that they could be integrated into the working conditions, right? The ideal worker isn't someone who's unconstrained by things at home. When we're talking about nursing, it's the 85% of women who are balancing caregiving that they're getting paid for and caregiving that they're not getting paid for, right? And so the job potentially could accommodate that. These are some of the conflicts that people have, right? Like where they live, where they raise their children. Those things are pretty significant sources of personal stress for nurses. And those sources come from their paid work, not from their unpaid work. So the implications of this in thinking about absenteeism, right? Absenteeism is clearly not just a labor supply problem, and arguably in the occupation is largely not a labor supply problem, but is a problem associated with the work itself. So the problems have to do with the structure of the occupation. They have to do with labor demand, which I'll talk about in a second, and the inequality in the division of reproductive labor in the household. So in looking at the material from a reading between the lines version of what this is looking at for 2030. A plausible outcome of the way that they're talking about this without a gender perspective and with a sort of separate spheres thing in mind and with this ideal worker kind of thing in mind is 3 times punitive for women, right? It's punishing them, they're being unjustly maligned as shirkers, and that's considered a character defect, especially when you're doing human resource kind of work like this. And they're really just trying to meet the demands that they have outside of work. And those are the same demands that reproduce people in society to begin with. So instead, they're being punished for that, for doing their paid work, and they're also being maligned for it. And one of the things that really seems to be edging towards is, what if we substituted male nurses for female nurses? And so that's there in some of the plans for education. Also non-identifying gender, but sort of in a like, what if they weren't so encumbered? What if we were able to get workers that weren't so encumbered? That might be better. Which might be true, but it would also be a lot better if they actually changed the structure of the occupation to accommodate the people who are already in it, especially since it is one of the major employers of women. So there's this possible substitution issue coming out of that as a workforce strategy for global health in the next decade. And the second thing is that there's instability that comes through shared work, right? And part of that point there is that it's not women's work, right? That these are social problems, and women are just the ones paying the increased costs of them, right? These are social problems because social reproduction is necessary overall. So in terms of what I did for the study, how much time do I have left, Daniele?
About 8 minutes.
Okay, all right, perfect.
I've been sending you alerts in the chat.
I know I'm on a different window, and
okay.
So
there's
okay.
also a question. There's also a question in case you want to take a look at that. It seems like a quick answer. So
some countries resolve the problem better than others. Well, this is an agreement that's signed on by all the members of the World Health Organization, right? So this World Health Assembly is the decision-making body. So in theory, yes, there should be that there should be country-specific responses to it, but this doesn't really deal with that. And if anything, the country-specific responses are much more likely to take the between the lines guidance and work on substituting male workers for women workers in this scenario. I'm going to come back to David's question once I go through more of the presentation. So the project itself, I did this field work. I did semi-structured interviews with 71 nurses. They were about 2 hours long. They were all Black women nurses in a public hospital in Johannesburg. Some of you have already heard about this research. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. It was basically like a snowball sample. I was in a public hospital. I recorded these interviews that I did with nurses. The study was approved by multiple different institutions. Talked about questions about stressors of their work, covered different levels of pay and different degrees of education. It was pretty evenly broken up between 3 tiers of nursing, which is also 3 tiers of pay and 3 tiers of education. So I want to go into some of the quotes in the little bit of time that I've got, just to talk about how the nurses see these problems. Right. So this nurse was actually one of the, she wasn't a matron, she was a head nurse for a day clinic, which is a fairly substantial clinic and a pretty significant job. One might think of her as part of management. She clearly doesn't think of herself as part of management. And she was saying that the management will come and complain about absenteeism, but they don't even know why the girls are absent, talking about the nurses. They have young kids, the kids are sick, they can't leave their sick kids at home, so they have to stay home. I would say the management isn't on our side, right? And that's one of the reasons I would say that at the country level, if the easiest solution is to replace female nurses with men, right? That they're not going to have these same kinds of issues, right? So from a management perspective, from a state perspective, that may well be where that ends up going, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, except for the replacement part, because there is a global shortage of nurses. People talked about care for their family. So it's care for kids and then care for other family members. There's a lot of morbidity and mortality in South Africa due to HIV, although the mortality aspect of that is really well controlled now with antiretrovirals. But this nurse's mom has HIV, and she, was talking about wanting to go and take care of her mom sometimes, that she knows she's suffering there, but she's stuck taking care of people for her paid work. And she brings up this issue of being short-staffed, which turns out to be a popular sentiment. This is another this nurse is HIV positive herself, and she was talking about short staffing, where she's saying, I experienced this in the ward. They're saying that I have to come back to work. I was on the phone with HR and they're saying you have to come back, and I'm saying I'm sick and I can't. So staff shortages and overwork were really from the worker side, the way that they were framing these issues. So it moves from, in theory, being a labor supply issue to, for the nurses, being a question of labor demand, right? That there wasn't enough labor demand, that there are these shortages in the hospital anyway, and that people aren't being replaced when they retire or pass away or resign or become sick, or whatever. And so there's a cyclical dynamic to this, right? Because if a couple of nurses are out, if one nurse dies, 2 people are out for maternity leave, and you have a set of 7 people working together, that means now there's 4 people sharing the entire load of nursing, which increases burnout and can cause people also to resign, which has been a significant problem there. This one person is talking about being absent, why people are absent from work. This is a good one of like how you explain absenteeism. Sometimes they're just tired, and then they'll come up with problems and say, well, it's family stuff, but then they come back and they just say, I was tired and needed rest, which in 12-hour shifts and then a heavy load of work at home shouldn't be all that surprising. This one I really liked because this nurse was very concerned about patient care, right? Where she's saying, I just feel sorry for these other patients because we can't get to everything that we're supposed to get to. So what happens with the labor supply angle is that this is privatizing social problems, right? And what this does is obscure the interdependencies that are actually causal of absenteeism, in the sense that there's a shortage of workers, they were overworked, and so then they're tired and miss work. So the origins, again, are not in the household, that these are occupational issues, and they're occupational issues that may be amenable to occupational interventions. Family responsibilities clearly play a significant role, but this is also family responsibilities being what reproduces society itself. Seems like something we might want to accommodate for in an occupation that's 85% women. Yeah, I mean, so this last line is the thing that really touches back on the other paper, which is that all of this is characteristic of the ways that we organize production and reproduction under capitalism, right? The ideal worker under capitalism is someone who is unconstrained by any kind of outside of paid work concerns. The last piece of this that I'm going to talk about is interdependence, right? Absence to one's own sickness or a family member's sickness is one thing, right? Nurses' well-being depends on their own families. But because of the way the workload is shared, nurses' well-being also depends on their colleagues' well-being and their colleagues' families' well-being. So the interdependency is not just of like peers at work, right? These are interdependent families because of their people who are being sent out of the household and working in the space and then coming back into the household. So what that means is, as an occupational group, nurses' collective household conditions are what threaten healthcare systems, right? So when you look at this from the perspective of labor supply and absenteeism in individual workers, you're totally missing this degree of interdependency and how it's collective household conditions that are the problem. The pandemic offers really extreme conditions for this. The endogeneity in that is extra problematic because if you have nurses who get sick or pass away, if you have nurses who get sick, they increase demand for care while decreasing supply, right? And so there's an endogeneity issue in terms of what kind of care is going to be supplied and both the quantity and quality of that. So ultimately, this review of mine of their 5-year check-in on the global strategy for human resources for health for 2030 is that gender awareness is an inadequate approach, that understanding why and how gender actually matter are really important to what you're going to do and change about the occupation, not about the workers that are in it. And basically, the bottom line of all of that is that the conditions of social reproduction are labor conditions, and there are labor conditions in paid work and in unpaid work. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. This is extremely stimulating. So I'll let you answer David Katz's question that's been lingering in the chat, and then I'll open it up for others.
So David's question, I don't know if other people see this. So is a factor behind your findings that neoclassical economics envisions an economy with no power relations, no role for obligation, no awareness of the need to reproduce the economy and society over time, but instead a vision that sees only free individual choice? Right, so that's why I was saying that this is, the neoclassical version of this is a sort of fixated on labor supply and individual and privatization, where the feminist political economy or feminist radical political economy approach is not looking at decision making, it's looking at the constraints under which people make the decisions. Right? And so yes, that is certainly a major issue of that from a traditional economics approach, which is another reason that we should be concerned about economists advising institutions like the World Health Organization that are not coming from these kinds of perspectives. Curious about gender structure for other healthcare workers. Me too. I've only done this study with nurses, but yes, Patty, I also am curious about the structure of this for other healthcare workers. I would imagine, I actually know for sure that job security is less, significantly less, because those workers are not typically unionized and the nurses' unions are very strong.
Yeah,
Catherine,
go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks. That's really interesting, Jen. Thank you for the presentation. So I had just two minor questions or thoughts. One is you were talking about replacing female nurses with male nurses and how, maybe that's okay, except for that there's a global shortage of nurses and what is that, what are the equity considerations? But I was also thinking about, male, it's at least in the US, I know it's well known that male nurses earn more than female nurses because of pay gaps between men and women. And so if there are more male nurses, won't overall the cost of nursing go up for the hospital? And that also could be pressure from the lack of supply of nurses. So I'm just wondering, sort of from the management's perspective, there might actually be some complications in substituting male and female nurses. So that's one piece. And then the other, when you were talking about the social reproduction needs of the nurses and their home lives, I was just wondering if you came across any changes in policies from the healthcare providers. I'm just thinking, I had a baby during the pandemic, and I know the midwifery practice where I went, they shifted, the midwives used to work 24-hour shifts, but then early on in the pandemic, they changed it to 12-hour shifts, which still sounds crazy to those of us who are economists and don't typically work 12-hour shifts, but it was for their own immunity and their own sort of resilience is the way that they talked about it. So I was just wondering if you observed any of that in any of the places that you were studying. Any kind of accommodation or flexibility or acknowledgement that these are people with their own needs to reproduce themselves.
So let me talk about that one first. The answer is yes, but it was always informal. So it would be like the sister in charge is allowing someone to leave early because their kid has a parent-teacher meeting or something like that. And that kind of ad hoc-y way of creating flexibility is just going to reinforce other kinds of hierarchies that already exist in those kinds of institutions. So those things shouldn't be left up to individual policies. They should be the providers, which is typically, when we talk about providers, we're typically talking about employers. When we talk about practitioners, we're talking about people doing the work. So that really needs to come from the provider side, not from ad hoc management, the way that it, at minimum, favoritism is a problem, but there are also other kinds of ethnic tensions that can be that could become problematic with that. So yes and no. I mean, the nurses unions are very strong, which is one of the reasons that I argue in a paper in PLOS that there is some potential for navigating this and that this should be part of union negotiations. But to get to your first question, the union representatives are almost all men. So you have at the individual hospital level, women who are reps locally, but in the power structure in the nurses unions, there is often just, I mean, it was 89% men or something at the time that I was doing the interviews. So yes, there are complications with this. But so what I meant to say wasn't that there weren't issues of replacing women with men. It was that let's not replace women with men. There is a global shortage. If we're going to train male nurses, then like, you know, we do need more nurses. Like there's, you know, pandemic aside, we already had a like many millions, 30 million nurses shortage or something. So, so having men get into nursing wouldn't be the worst thing in the world in terms of the shortage of nurses that we have. Those people are not currently just immediately hireable because there aren't a bunch of trained nurses. When you have a country like South Africa, which has like a 40% open unemployment rate, that again makes it seem like maybe that's not, you know, such a bad thing that if there's massive unemployment. At the same time, nursing, like these other professionalized occupations, have all kinds of licensing, and the requirements for education are handed down from the South African Nurses Committee, SANC. So that changed like the kind of investment that's required for education also. So in some case, the cost of nursing shouldn't go up. It could, but if anything, it would require investment from states to educate men before there would be hireable. So that wouldn't, at this point, at least enter concerns for hospitals largely. The pay grades are also very concretely established. There's very little latitude in them. They're set by state governments and agreed to with the unions. But there are complexities outside of those for sure. So Janice's question in the Q&A, there's a fair amount of poaching nurses by developed countries from developing countries. Along with male replacement, how important is poaching of doctors and nurses? I'm aware of voluntary restriction against this in OECD countries. That is a significant problem and there are lots of nurses in South Africa, for example, who are struggling with shortages and supplies and things like that, who would also prefer to be working in a place where they weren't facing that kind of moral injury on a daily basis, where they can't treat people in the way that they would like to because they don't have access to the resources to do it. So that comes also sort of from both sides. I don't know anything about poaching doctors, but the nurse version of that, there is recruitment that happens. But at the same time, I also had nurses asking me about it. So it doesn't seem like there's that much accessible information necessarily about that either. But certainly that exacerbates the inequity, the health inequity that we see between developing or less developed and developed countries. Right? I mean, in the same way that you see flows of caring resources from underdeveloped to developed countries in all kinds of ways, from nannies to housekeeping, like their feminized labor shifting from underdeveloped countries and being pushed to developed countries is common across feminized occupations. Nursing is no different, except for the massive shortage in nursing and the fundamental role that nurses play in reproducing society itself. Right? Because public health completely depends on this, especially where there are no doctors available, which is a lot of the less developed world. So hopefully that answers that adequately.
All right, so any more questions from the audience? Not only to Jen, but to also Catherine and Laura, since we have about 15 minutes left. I'll just let people type if they want to, or you can raise your hand in the and I'll see that. Actually, I'm looking at that. So let's see. any further comments from the panelists? That's something that we can do also, since both the Q&A and hands are quiet. So I'm gonna give. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Daniele. I don't know how intentional it was or not, but for organizing an all-female panel. It's a very cool thing to have at the ASSA. So I appreciate your organizing us, and it's been great. And
it's only there because you agreed to it. So I'm really happy about this. Of course, and it's unfortunate that Zongjin couldn't join us, but this was a great panel, like a great conclusion to these 3 sessions that I organized for ERPI. And I really want to thank ERPI for giving us the space for this, because it's been a tremendous source of support for me personally, but also I'm for all of us, like trying to make a little difference. I really wanted to give like a final word to each of you before we will log off. So I'll just start with Laura.
Thank you, Daniele, again, and ERPI. Well, I was very glad to be at this panel. Thank you, Jennifer and Kate, for the great presentations. I learned a lot, and great to be here. Thanks.
Okay. Well, she says something. Well, yeah, Jen.
I already spoke, but yeah, and thanks to ERPI and thanks to all of our participants. I can see there's a really good turnout for a virtual event. So thanks to everybody.
Yeah, thank you for putting this together. Thank you, ERPI, for giving us space. Thank you, ERPI, for being ERPI. And yeah, this has been definitely one of my favorite ones to be in. And I'm looking forward to thinking more carefully about the kind of fiscal policy that both of you talked about in the context of these kinds of questions about the workforce.
Awesome.
Thanks, y'all.
So like with that, we'll be calling it a session. And thanks everybody for coming. And we'll see you around in some way, shape, or form in the future. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Bye.